Hello everyone. Today's session is a continuation of our previous session, and we are discussing trade, production pattern, and world inequality. What is the link between all this? So, since it's a continuation of the previous session, let us quickly recap what we have discussed in the previous session. We have talked about the importance of global trade. We have presented some numbers related to that. We have talked about the global inequality, and we have presented some numbers related to that as well. Towards the end, we actually had discussed about different ways of looking at inequality, then the importance of looking at patterns of trade, production pattern, etc. And at the end, we had discussed various theoretical perspectives regarding the consequences of free trade, especially with respect to growth inequality and so on. Today, we shall focus on trade and inequality from the perspective of inter-country, between-country inequality. And as you can see, the structure and the learning objectives of our session today is on your screen. We shall, in the first segment, we shall talk about colonialism, colonial trade, and its consequences for inter-country inequality or gap between different countries in the world. Now, this you can think of more about the politics of world trade, or more from the perspective of global politics. In this case, we are taking the case of colonial era. And in the second phase, second segment in our discussion today, we will talk about, again, trade and inequality between countries, but this will be more of economic in nature, while the colonial period thing has both the political as well as economic aspect. The second one, even though the second one is connected with the political issues and all, like colonialism and everything, but there's also deeply economic, fundamental structural economic factors in it. So both are actually connected, but there are some nuanced differences between these two segments. That's why we shall have trade and divergence, or trade and inequality 1 and trade and inequality 2 in our discussion today. The first one, as mentioned, is trade and the divergence between countries, the first segment, right? Okay. Now what you see on your screen is a table where we have given some numbers, and these numbers are taken from the Madison database, and these are all in PPP terms in $1990. These are per capita GDP of different countries in different periods. We have not given the whole table because we just wanted to highlight some of the important numbers here. Think about the first century. India and China were kind of in the similar situation, as you can see. By 1500, they're not very far from each other, but China is little ahead here. And UK, Netherlands, they're also little ahead of China, India, but the gap is still not very high. Okay. By 1600, you see the gap has already increased. But then what happens after in the coming centuries? The gap keeps increasing. There's an increasing divergence between these countries. Now, remember, 1600 is also the year when East India Company was established. This company played a key role in, promoting the exploitating kind of trade, across colonies. It played a key role in its expanding the UK's influence in countries like China, and so on. You can see that India could achieve what UK had achieved in 1500, let's say the per capita income level of 714, India could exceed that only by 1981. So you understand how things happened in between, the great divergence that happened. Remember, it is not to undermine the benefits of industrial revolution, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that during colonial era, a great divergence happened. Next, we are presenting on your screen a very interesting graph, which kind of traces the period between 1700 and 2000. You can see the per capita income of United Kingdom, United States, that of China and India. You can clearly see the divergence that happened over the 18th and 19th century and almost by the middle of 20th century. It is only after the decolonization started, after these countries got independence, you can see how they improved their economic positions. And towards the end of 20th century, you see the graph is going in an interesting way. Now it's going up very significantly. China and India are picking up their per capita income, right? So while there is a divergence initially and over the colonial era, that gap actually reduces after these countries get independence. In the whole post-colonial era, you see there's an improvement. And they're moving towards United States and United Kingdom. Whether they'll catch up ever, that's an open-ended question. Not the topic today, but I would want you to, pay some attention to this graph. So this actually showed the relative position of these countries over time and highlighted about the great divergence between countries during the colonial era and how things changed after the colonial era ended. Now, if we think that when India-China started initially, before the colonial era, it's not that their position was really bad in the world economy. Maybe per capita income might have been little lesser than UK and all. But if you think of the global manufacturing production, the distribution of global manufacturing, you can clearly see that in the 18th century, even by the late 18th century, early 19th century, the contribution of countries like China and an Indian subcontinent in the global manufacturing was considerably larger as compared to what you see afterwards, what you see in the 20th century. Look at the figure that happened by the beginning of 20th century. It came down to an abysmally low level for India, for example, its contribution to world global manufacturing. So clearly, an Oriental perspective will try to argue that where the East is more like it has that spirituality, but where the West had more of the economic prospect, that is not entirely true. The East had its own economic prosperity before colonialism came into being, right? So you can clearly see, even towards the end of the Mughal era, that the contribution of countries like India, the Indian subcontinent, what we can think of, was significantly larger in the global manufacturing, which came down significantly at a low level, by 20th century, by the beginning of 20th century, over the 19th century and so on, right? And that situation has not, unfortunately, improved. While towards the 21st century, you see there's some sort of re-emergence of Asia. By the way, this graph also highlights the importance of the North America, right? You can see how significant they became over the years. Okay, now so what do you have so far? So countries like India, China, they started off from a good situation, but the gap between them and the Western world increased, UK particularly in this case, and colonialism played a key role. And if you look at imperialism in China and also imperialism in India, you will understand the colonial trading and colonial rule actually changed the production pattern of these countries. For example, Chinese good had a huge market in England, right? It had a huge market, but then UK did not have that amount of silver to import so much goods. What did they do? They traded opium, Indian opium, and they used that to pay for their imports. Now, between this episode of 1790 and 1832, this whole opium trade led to a creation of a generation of addicts and social instability. And there were clashes between the king government and British merchants, ultimately which escalated into what is famously known as the Opium War. As a result, the British were actually given the island of Hong Kong, and they had the trading rights in ports of Canton and Shanghai. Well, UK did not have a colonial rule like they had in, let's say, in India or Africa, but they had significant control of some parts of the Chinese territory. Now, if you come to the Indian context, even here, so India, it had its own textile, it had excellent textile, but British people could not compete with it. So when they came to India, the British merchants wanted to take, instead of buying the textiles, they preferred to buy the raw materials. Please mind it. This is also a beginning of an era which makes India from an exporter of the final goods. Slowly over the years, India will become an exporter of the raw materials. This is a significant change because now the British people took the raw materials, used it there, produced the final goods, and now the global market is flooded with machine-made, mass-scale production of textile. Of course, this is much cheaper, so the Indian weavers could not compete with that. It starts the beginning of an era of deindustrialization in India. These are apart from the fact that in certain cases, the hands and the fingers of the weavers of India were even chopped off by the British colonizers. Now, you can clearly understand the colonial trade actually changed the production pattern, and that had significant consequences for divergence between these two countries in terms of their industrialization, in terms of their per capita income. You know, there's something we have put regarding the East India Company, which you can look at later. There's a popular story that the Brits would like to promote. They tend to argue that colonial rule was very costly for them. It did not really benefited them. Did not really benefit them. So it was out of the benevolence of the kingdom that of the empire that the colonial period continued. But some scholars like Utsa Patnaik, they have looked into the detailed data of tax and trade of about more than a century, over 200 years. And they have identified, they've calculated that Britain siphoned off a surplus of about $45 trillion. Now, just to understand this is roughly about 15 to 17 times of UK's GDP today. This was the amount of surplus they took away from India. Now, you can understand how colonial period clearly, by some sort of coercion and their own trade policy, which you can see on the left panel, we have given a structure. You can read it later, and you can figure out how they made very interesting, intricate policies and changes so as to ensure to, siphon off a lot of surplus from their colonies. So two things we want to highlight here. A, through the colonial era, the gap, the divergence continued, and it increased over the years, the divergence between countries, and also the trade policies were such which changed the production pattern of these countries. India, or countries like India, became exporters of what is called primary goods, and we'll be coming to that in the next segment of our discussion. Instead of exporter of final goods like textile, they were sending more of the raw materials. So this is a huge change, right? Because this change happened through a whole painful process of deindustrialization over the colonial era. Now a question for you. Please go back to the graphs we have presented and try to identify since when the share of Indian subcontinent in the global manufacturing production became abysmally low. So we gave you a question to think about. Since when the share of Indian subcontinent in the global manufacturing production became abysmally low? Well, the trend kind of started with the mid of 19th century, but by the end of that, you clearly see that it has come down to a very low level. You can go back and check that in the graph that we have presented. Okay, now we are entering in the second segment of our discussion today. We have named this also as trade and divergence, but this is where we are talking more about the structural factors which kind of put the developing and underdeveloped countries in a disadvantageous position when they get into trade with the developed part of the world, which is called the core, and the developing or the less developed part of the world is considered as the periphery. Now, this is connected to the very structure of the countries, the structure of the production, the pattern of production, and the nature of trade. Now, in this context, the famous Previs-Singer hypothesis is relevant, and this hypothesis is named after, as you can see on your screen, by these two great economists called Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer. They came up with their own arguments over the time independently, but later it got consolidated into one single hypothesis. We have also given you in the slide some interesting information about their individual life, some about their scholarly life, and so on. Now, before we get into the main argument of the hypothesis, we need to just browse and perhaps learn some of the basic concepts. We need to understand the difference between what is known as primary goods and what is known as manufacturing goods. Now, primary goods are those goods which is like ready to be sold for production and or consumption, just as it was found in nature. So you can think of like crude oil, you can think of coal, you can think of agricultural products like wheat, coffee beans, and so on. On the contrary, manufacturing goods are those where some sort of capital and labor has been invested and to transform the raw material into some different desired format, right? So these are the good which is produced mainly by the application of labor and capital to raw materials and other intermediate inputs. So some of the examples could be steel, chemicals, papers, and textiles, machinery, clothing, vehicles, etc. Now you see most of the things that we see around us can be considered as a manufacturing good, but the raw materials and the agricultural products are considered as the primary goods, roughly speaking. The other important concept that we need to understand to understand this hypothesis is the concept of terms of trade. Now, there are various ways to think about terms of trade. Now, here what we basically implies, we are taking of two concepts, the gross barter terms of trade and the net barter terms of trade. In very simple terms, it implies that how much import a country can buy given the amount of export it is sending off. So let's say you are exporting 2 kilos of rice. How many clothes can you import in exchange of that? Now that is something you consider as the terms of trade. Okay, so if you are sending 10 kilos of rice, how many clothes you can buy in return as import divided by export. So the first gross barter terms of trade can be defined as the ratio of import quantity and divided by the export quantity index. Now, if that ratio deteriorates, meaning if the TOT or the terms of trade falls, that means with the same amount of export, you are able to import a lower amount. Let's take the example. Let's say for now 10 kilos of rice, you are able to import 4 pieces of clothes. After 1 or 2 years, in exchange of the 10 kilos of rice, which is your export, your country is importing 2 pieces of clothes. Of course, there's a decline in terms of trade. You can also think of the terms of trade using some sort of price index, right? Instead of using the quantity index. That is the net barter terms of trade, which is also very popular. Okay, a very simple question for you. Can you think of some sort of examples of primary goods and manufacturing goods? Okay, so we asked you to think of some sort of examples of primary goods and manufacturing goods. Think of some of the raw materials, some of the agricultural goods like wheat, cotton, all these are considered as primary goods, and something like this pen would be a manufacturing good, right? Okay. Now, let's understand the genesis of the Previs-Singer hypothesis. It is basically talking about the diminishing terms of trade and therefore the inequality between what they're calling the core and the periphery countries. Now, before getting into the main thesis, you have to understand the works by Ernest Engel and Charles P. Kindleberger. It was about in the middle of 19th century, as early as that, Engel actually identified this one interesting finding. So he basically had the expenditure of 153 Belgian families, and he argued that he actually found that the poorer a family is, higher would be its share on food-related products and so on as a percentage of total expenditure. So, for example, a relatively poorer family will have a higher percentage of total expenditure allocated or going towards food consumption and so on. It implies as a family or household gets richer over time or across families, if you find a richer household, the ratio of expenditure for food to the total expenditure will be lower for a relatively richer household. Now, this is an argument that you can therefore think about at a macro level as well. That what actually in his own words, what he is saying, that the poorer a family, the greater the proportion of its total expenditure that must be devoted to the provision of food. And later, he actually concluded, therefore, the wealthier a nation, right? A wealthier a nation, the smaller the proportion of food to total expenditure. So basically what you are finding for households, can be perhaps, taken up at the macro level as well for a nation as a whole. The richer a country gets, relatively lower share of the total expenditure goes for food consumption. About a century later, Kindleberger also kind of took from that particular perspective and argued this, that the terms of trade would move against agriculture and raw material countries as the world standard of living increases. So think about as the overall world becomes relatively richer, then the relative bargaining position of the countries which are exporting these kinds of goods. Remember, we are discussing the production pattern. like primary goods, their position will be relatively worse off. And he's actually emphasizing on the Engel's law, what we learn in microeconomics. So he's referring to that as well. Actually, these are the things that actually played a key role in formation of the hypothesis, which is famously known as the PS hypothesis or Previs-Singer hypothesis later. Now, this hypothesis was initially developed by Hans Singer in 1948-49 and then was later developed by Rolf Prebisch. What does it argue? Basically, it argues that the prices of primary commodities will decline over time relative to the manufacturing goods. Now, remember, we discussed terms of trade. Now, think about the price of primary commodities divided by the price of the manufacturing goods. If a country is, more exporting relatively more, primary commodities and importing more of manufacturing goods, and if the price of primary commodities is rising at a slower rate than the price of manufacturing goods, then this country whose export is relatively more, oriented towards primary goods, they will lose out in the process. Clearly, right? That deterioration will happen of terms of trade. Now, this is what they're talking about for developing countries, that this would lead to a decline in terms of trade for developing countries, because developing countries are usually the exporter of primary goods and developed nations are usually the exporter of the manufactured goods. Now, however, this is the relationship that they then took up, and Prebisch and Singer focused on the rising per capita income gap between such countries, the core countries, the highly industrialized nations, the developed nations, and the periphery country, the countries which are main exporters or they are primarily exporters of primary goods. Now, what happens therefore, according to them, due to this static specialization in the production of primary commodities, developing world has been excluded from enjoying the benefits of technological progress and industrialization. You see, this whole argument is based on the very structure of an economy, the production pattern, and therefore the composition of trade. Now, clearly you understand this, according to them, leads to increasing inequality between countries. Remember, we were discussing trade, production pattern, and inequality, global inequality. Now, this we are seeing from the perspective of countries at the periphery and the countries at the core, increasing gap between these two kinds of countries. What could be some of the reasons of such fall in terms of trade? There is a demand side explanation, as you can see on the screen, and there is a supply side explanation. The demand side explanation on the right side we have given, this is provided by Singer, and the supply side explanation was provided by Prebisch. The supply side argument is basically this, that in the Western countries or developed nations, more industrialized countries, the labor unions are relatively stronger, their bargaining position is better, which leads to a relatively higher cost of production. As a result, vis-a-vis what happens in the countries where you don't have, where you have mainly the primary goods production, the cost is not that high compared to the manufacturing goods cost. So clearly, the manufacturing goods producing countries, they have a beneficial position in terms of, as far as the terms of trade is considered. This is more of a supply side argument, that higher bargaining power of the working class due to better, more powerful labor union leads to higher cost of production for manufacturing vis-a-vis the primary goods. On the other side, the demand side argument is this, that the income elasticity of primary good is less than 1 or relatively lower. What does it mean? It means if income, let's say, increases by 1%, the expenditure towards primary goods will increase by less than 1%. Now, that definitely, makes this kind of a situation. It leads to this kind of a situation where the income growth benefits relatively the manufacturing goods demand, because the demand for primary goods does not go up that much, right? So therefore, the argument is this: there's an income rise, leads to the demand for primary commodities decline rapidly than the demand for manufactured goods. There's a decline in relative price of primary goods, and then of course it worsens the terms of trade for developing countries. Okay, now we are giving you some sort of pattern of trade numbers, right? Because you see, the previous argument is kind of heavily dependent on the pattern of trade thing. Now we are presenting some latest figures. I want you to focus on the graph where we are presenting the numbers related to trade in goods by stage of processing and trade in goods by broad category. Depending on the stage of processing, you have different kinds of products. You may have primary goods, intermediate goods, consumer goods, capital goods, and you can clearly see that as far as the stage of processing is concerned, the intermediate goods is forms the bulk of the world trade. Clearly, well, the other important element of the world trade is the consumer goods. Now, these are as far as the stage of processing is considered. Now, if you look at the broad categories of different goods that are being traded, here we have agricultural goods, you have natural resources goods, we have manufacturing goods. Now, you are saying in that here, it is the manufacturing goods which forms the bulk of the global trade. Now, this is different kinds of goods we are talking about, depending on which stage of processing they are in, depending on what kinds of goods they are, right? Now, let us see what is the relative position of different countries in the world as far as these goods are considered. So, what do we have here? On the left side, we have this export and import values by stage of processing. On the right side, we have export and import values by broad category. So, what we see here is that we have primary goods, we have numbers for total exports and imports, we have intermediate goods, exports, imports, similarly for consumer goods and capital goods. On the right side also, we have agricultural, natural resources and manufacturing goods, and there also we are presenting the export number and imports number. What do you see here? You also see one another dimension that is placed in these two graphs. You see that how much of the total trade or let's say how much of the total exports of a particular kind of commodity, let's say primary goods, how much of it is contributed by developed nations, developing nations, the BRIC countries and less developed countries, right? So what you see here is, reveals a lot of things about the production pattern here. Now, developed countries account for the bulk of the world trade, both in terms of goods differentiated by stage of processing and also by broad category. I want you to focus on these two graphs as we go along. Besides other developing country regions, a significant amount of trade is linked to the BRIC countries. This is sky blue on your graph, right? Especially in relation to the trade of intermediate and manufacturing. They also tend to import few consumer goods while exporting a relatively large share of consumer goods. Developing countries tend to export more natural resources than they import. Now, this is important. Developing countries, countries other than the BRIC countries here we're talking about, tend to export more natural resources than they import, unlike the developed countries. And less developed countries, please pay attention here, only represents a small share in all types of goods, with a larger share in the exports of primary products and the imports of intermediate goods. Well, while some of these evidences actually support what Previous Singer would argue, some of these evidences are not really in tandem with what they were saying. But this is as far as the distribution of global trade is considered. To understand how much a country depends on the export of primary goods, we need to look at what is known as the agricultural and natural resources dependence index. And we have provided the definition of it. See, you can see on your screen that the commodity dependence index or primary goods dependence index is computed as the share of the value of exports in primary products over the total value of exports. So if you see that the value of exports of primary goods divided by the total value of export for a country is much higher, you can clearly understand that country's export depends relatively more on primary goods, right? And this graph is very fascinating in the sense that the colors of the maps that show the colors that are shown on the map, it actually represents the extent of the index numbers. Basically, you have the colors are based on the value of the index. What you see here that although many countries in the world would like to have more diversification in their exports, agriculture and natural resources still represents a large share of export baskets of many developing countries. Commodity dependence, the primary goods dependence is more evident for energy exporting countries in the Middle East, raw material suppliers in Africa, as well as for Latin American countries, where agriculture still represents a large share of total exports. However, if we go to the next slide where we are presenting the change in the dependence index, we see that dependence indices have declined over the past years for majority of countries. But it does not take away the fact that clearly many of the developing and less developed countries are relatively more primary goods export dependent. Now, it kind of corroborates with what Previous Singer would perhaps argue. Now, what happens with the terms of trade? Does it deteriorate over time? That's a more empirical issue. Even this one, that to what extent the dependency is changing and so on, these need to be carefully looked at, and we'll get into that immediately after a few moments. Okay, so here's a question for you. Can you identify some countries whose agricultural and natural resource dependence index is very high? Okay, so we gave you this question. Can you identify some of the countries in the world whose agricultural and natural resource dependence index is very high? Of course, you can go back to the map and identify that it's some of the African countries where this the dependence index is very high, right? But of course, that number is also changing. So did this theory go without criticism? No, of course not. So people said, how can you really consider the price ratio as the terms of trade, because even developed countries export a lot of raw materials, primary goods. But then a series of research since 1980s has again brought back Prebissinger hypothesis in the limelight. They actually criticized the criticisms, and given new numbers, new figures to argue in favor of Prebissinger hypothesis. Like any topic, even this is a dynamic one, and things have changed over the years. So depending on the time, technique, and the data you have, you may come up with different kind of conclusions. So to summarize what we have discussed so far, we have actually main focus of today's discussion has been the trade and divergence between countries or inequality between countries, where we looked at two things. A, what happened during colonial era, and B, what happens due to change as a structural reason. So both colonial episode and the other factors decides the pattern of production, which in turn influences the income gap or change in the income gap through international trade and so on. And in this case, we have discussed the Prebissinger hypothesis, the increasing gap between core and periphery, the developed and developing nations, and so on. In the next session, we shall focus more on the trade and within country inequality. Thank you.